review of this Fabiano game against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Okay, so the game starts out pawn to e4. Maxime, even with a year break, he chooses to play the Sicilian Najdorf. So pawn to c5, knight f3, d6, d4, trade, knight f6, knight c3, a6. And we've reached the starting position of the Sicilian Najdorf system that was really championed by Garry Kasparov throughout much of the 1990s until he retired around 2004. So he plays the Najdorf. Now, mind you, Maxime has played the Najdorf a lot, even in this past year. The handful of tournaments that have been held, he's continued to play the system. And in Tata Steel, which was held in January, I believe he lost a very surprising 3 games with the Najdorf system. So he has not had a lot of luck with it lately, but he continues to hold true to the opening. So pawn to e6 played here. Queen to d2 is played by Fabiano in this position. Or not queen to d2, sorry. Bishop g5, e6, pawn to f4 is played. Queen to b6. So black plays the poison pawn variation. There are many different setups. You can play bishop e7. You can play like knight d7, queen c7, and b5 here to try to develop on the queen side. A lot of different ideas. Queen b6 was a line that Garry Kasparov actually played most of the time. I myself tried this against Fabiano a handful of times. It did not work super well, but I did play it nonetheless. Queen d2, queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3. So what you end up with is a situation where black has gone pawn grabbing on the queen side. Queen takes b2 and queen a3. At the same time, you'll notice that you have 6 pieces that are not developed at all. Here, your king, your bishop, your rook, your king, your bishop, your rook are not developed. Bishop, knight, rook are not developed. Everything is really underdeveloped here for black. So e5 played by Fabiano. This is a line that I think was first sort of, it wasn't first played, but it was really brought into the public consciousness when Vachier-Lagrave was playing a lot of Najdorf games in the mid to late 2010s, 11s, around there, and it's become a main line ever since. So h6, bishop h4, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, knight d7. Now I know knight d5 is also considered to be a line here. It's very, very sharp. Lot of theory, but again, I'm not going to delve too deeply into that because first of all, I don't play this line. Secondly, I don't think it's overly relevant to the game itself. So knight d7 played here by Maxime. Knight to e4 played by Fabiano. As I said, there was a game, I don't remember who exactly played it, but there was a Vachier-Lagrave game that really brought this line to the forefront and made it very prominent. Now, more recently, I think like Jan Nepomniachtchi, he's had a lot of games in this unit. We know in the Champions Tour, the last event, there was Anish against Jan. They played a lot of these poison pawn Najdorfs as well. Okay, so knight e4 played here by white. The idea again being, when you look at black's pieces, no development, and white's got a lot of stuff developed. Like if you can get the bishop to c4, castle, black's going to be destroyed because you have no piece in the game. You basically won a pawn on b2, and that's it. Oh, it's Karyakin versus Vachier-Lagrave. Okay, that's the game. Apologies, I had the colors wrong, but that was the game that I was thinking about. All right, so queen takes a2 played here. That's now rook d1 played by Fabiano. Queen to d5 played by Maxime. Again, you'll notice black is now up 2 pawns. He's grabbed 2 pawns with his queen. But the same problem exists where you have no coordination or development of all these different pieces. So queen d5 is played. Queen to e3 is played here by Fabiano. Let me turn off the sound 1 second, you guys. Sorry for that. Queen e3 played here. Queen takes e5. So now what you have is you have a situation where black is now up 3 pawns. 1, 2, 3 pawns, but all these moves have been made with your queen. So again, the same problem exists where you have 6 pieces that are not going anywhere, and you're up 3 pawns, but you only have your queen developed. So c3 is played here. Oh, you guys like the sound? Okay, I'll put it back on. Sorry. So c3 is played here. Bishop to c5 played by Maxime. Again, I presume that all this is preparation. Not 100% sure, but that's my assumption. Bishop g3, queen to d5. Now here Fabiano plays a very peculiar move, and a move that I suspect when you let the engines go really, really deep is completely fine. Again, the engine that I have on, I don't really trust it. When you have a year or more to prepare for this event, players are going to have very, very deep analysis that even at low depths computers may not understand. So bishop c4 played by Fabiano. Looks like a crazy move. You sacrifice a bishop. Like, what's going on? I mean, is this like, I don't know, is this PogChamps or something? What's he doing? Free bishop. You're down a bishop here. So queen takes c4 is played. However, what the idea after bishop c4, queen takes c4 is that white can play bishop to d6 here. And the reason is that after bishop to d6, black has problems with his king and his bishop here. if black could castle the king here, black would be winning the game. He would have one extra juicer because white blundered the juicer on c4, and additionally the king would be very safe. The second problem black has here is not only can he not castle, but he has a problem with this bishop. If you trade the bishops on d6, after knight takes d6, your queen and your king get forked and you lose. So it's a very tricky position. I'm sure Fabiano will talk about this and what his preparation was or how deep it went. Now again, if you use a computer at low depth, it says bishop takes d4, and I don't know which move is right. Again, I'm not using a really strong engine. Let's just say pawn takes queen d5 bishop a3, for example. I don't know what the objective evaluation of this position is, but you'll see the king is still stuck in the center of the board. You cannot castle it. White has knight to d6 threats, hitting your king. There's knight f7 as well, and white can also castle the king to the king side. So you're up a piece here, but when you look at your coordination, you have 1 2 3 4 5 pieces on the original squares. King is stuck in the center. White has a nice jump to d6 here, and your queen is the only active piece. So again, very hard to judge what the objective evaluation is. I'm sure Fabiano will talk about it in depth in terms of what his preparation is. Now, the one thing that's very sad at the same time about this, as well, this is some fabulous preparation from Fabiano. It's a situation where I do suspect that now that it's been played, it will never be playable again. Players will go home, they will look with their computers, and probably within like 10 to 15 minutes, they will figure out exactly how to defend this position with black. But nonetheless, it is a great concept from Fabiano. So bishop to d6 played here. Now here, Maxime goes knight to f6. Very logical move. The idea being that now what you basically force white to do something with the knight. Now remember, white gave up a free bishop here on c4 earlier, so black is ahead in material and he's willing to sacrifice his bishop back here. So knight takes c5 is played again, not bishop takes, hoping for knight d6 because black can trade the knights on e4 and take the bishop on c5. Again, black has a knight and bishop, white has a knight. Much more importantly though, black will be able to castle the king next move. So knight takes c5 played by Fabiano. Maxime goes knight to d5, forking the queen on e3 and the pawn on c3 as and additionally you're going to have a trade of queens here. So even though white has all these pieces which look really menacing, especially the bishop, if you can get queens off the board, the king will be relatively safe on e8. So queen e5 played by Fabiano. Very nice move. Again, all preparation I suspect from Fabiano. Rook to g8 played here. And this is where you have a really tough situation. Do you go rook g8? Do you play queen takes c3? Again, you can take this pawn on c3, but what you'll notice is after king to f2 here, black has a lot of problems. Again, no development here, and white has all these pieces developed. The queen, the bishop, the knights, both your rooks are going to be in the center of the board. And even though black is ahead by a gazillion pawns, your king is not safe. And if your king gets checkmated, it doesn't matter how many pawns you have on the board. So in this game, what he does is he plays rook to g8 here. So now here Fabiano plays knight takes e6, pawn takes knight, knight takes pawn, and you'll see that black cannot take the knight on e6 because after queen takes e6, your king is under attack, but also your rook is under attack, and your knight is additionally falling here on d5 as well, so it's completely lost. So a really nice sacrifice. Again, as I alluded to earlier, this was all still preparation from Fabiano. Again, he had over a year to prepare, and so this was all preparation, still moving instantly. So knight takes e6. So here Maxime plays queen c3. Fabiano trades the queens on c3 and goes knight to c7 check, forking the king and the rook. Now again, when you look at the position, it looks like the worst is over for black here. He has 3 pieces, white has 2 pieces, and additionally queens are off the board, so the king should be safe to run out. So here king f7 is played by Maxime. Fabiano plays rook to d3, attacking the knight. Again, your rook also is stuck in this corner. It's very uncomfortable, and you're lacking development of these 3 pieces. So knight to e4 is played here by Maxime, just gambiting the rook in the corner and saying, look, at the end of the day, material will be even because I will have these 2 extra pawns, and even though you're gonna have a rook for a knight, I'll be able to simplify this into an endgame, which I should have chances to draw. So after knight e4, this was the first time that Fabiano started thinking in the game. Up to this point, he was in his preparation. What that is, to use a poker term, is this is sort of a tell. So when you're playing your opponent in the game of chess, and it doesn't matter whether it's classical chess, rapid chess, blitz chess doesn't apply as much, but like in classical chess or rapid chess, if your opponent blitzes out a lot of moves, that can sort of, it's scary, but it also can give you confidence, because what it means is that it means that your opponent is playing, you're basically playing all the best computer moves, and your opponent has looked at it and is responding to the absolute best moves. So after knight e4, Fabiano started thinking. So clearly what that tells us is that knight e4 was not the best move. It was not the top computer move first, and then secondly, that rook a7 was probably what he had calculated. And after rook a7, I mean, who knows what the objective valuation is. Computer at low depth is saying black is better, but as a human it's very hard to play this. It looks like you're lacking coordination. White is also going to castle. Like, for example, say you go knight to c6 here, white can castle with check, king goes to g6, and now after bishop to c5, your rook is also stuck in the corner here. So it's very hard to play here, and Maxime makes a practical decision. I did like this decision, playing knight to e4, and just he just jettisons the rook in the corner, castles, king g6 takes, knight c6, and he says, look, at this point I have a knight and 2 pawns in return for your rook on d3 here. So knight to b6, rook to d8 played by Maxime. Now again, there's going to be a lot of positions here where both players could have probably made better moves, but both players out of preparation on their own, just trying to play logical chess. So rook to d8 played, knight takes c8, rook takes c8 here, bishop to a3 played by Fabiano. Again, trying to keep the bishop on the board, because the way that white can win this is using the rooks and the bishop. So one thing with knights is they're not great pieces if they don't have outposts, and what Fabiano wants to do is he wants to go rook d7, try to soften these pawns on the queen side a little bit, but additionally maybe go bishop b2 and target the pawn on g7. Again, in endgames, the less material on the board, the harder it is to win when you have the extra material. You have the stronger piece like the rook here. So bishop a3, rook c7, rook f4 played here by Fabiano, knight to f6 by Maxime, bishop b2, very logical move, trying to ruin the pawn structures. When you look at the pawns here, black's pawns are all connected. He has 2 separate pawn formations where the pawns are connected to each other. So knight to e7 is played here, bishop takes f6, g takes f6, h4, and now here again, very hard to say whether, you know, these moves were right or wrong, but I felt like when I looked at this earlier, h5 was it felt a little bit loose here, because you end up in a position where you're going to end up with split pawns in some form or another. So rook c1, king h2, knight g6 played here, rook to f2, and now knight takes h4, rook h5. Again, an even trade of 1 for 1, but you'll see that the rooks become very powerful now. One thing that rooks thrive off of is open files. They really thrive off of the open files, where they can go all over the place and target all the pawns. So knight to g6, rook h7 played, and now Fabiano mops up the first pawn on the queen side. So now black only has a knight and a pawn for the rook, and additionally this pawn out on the wing is so weak that you're not going to be able to save it. White can go like rook a2, rook a7, and you're going to drop this pawn in a6. So knight to e5 played here. Fabiano plays rook b6, a move that I really do like. I don't know if it's technically, I do wonder if it's the best move, because it feels like maybe there's some way you can keep 2 rooks on the board, but we simplify into this end game where what you have is you have and the moves aren't really relevant. We reach this critical position where black has a king, a knight, and a pawn. White has a king, a rook, and a pawn. And this, according to table bases, is a theoretical draw, meaning that black will be able to survive this position and set up a fortress with knight maneuvers like knight f7, knight e5, or g5, or just back to e5. But again, even though table basis says it's a draw, we play the game and we see how it goes. So knight f7 is played by Maxime, king e4, and this is, I think, kind of the start of going wrong. Now again, I haven't looked super closely with table bases. It's a very long, very serious endgame that is deserving of a place in it, like the endgame manual by Dvoretsky, or something extremely advanced along of that nature. But it's not something that I'm going to go into depth here. So basically, right around this position, the position is actually winning for white, and the reason is, as Fabiano starts to realize, you can put this rook on g3, and as we'll see in the game, the one way that white can win this position is getting this king to h5. So for example, let me just make a couple of moves. If white can ever get a setup with the king on h5, and it doesn't matter where this knight is, it could be on e5 or g5, it will be winning if white can get the king here. So that's the one concept that you need to know in this position. So if we go back, let's go back to sort of the start of this. So we get this position, knight h6, rook a5, knight f7, rook a3, played by Fabiano. Now it's worth noting, if the pawn is on g3 here, this would be an easy draw for black because white no longer has access to his g file for his rook. So Fabiano correctly plays rook a3, idea to go rook g3, knight to d6 played here, king f4, knight to f5 played by Maxime, again trying to stop this access point. Fabiano goes rook d3, knight h6, and again I won't go too deep into how this is winning, but we have a couple of maneuvers here. Fabiano doesn't quite see the way to win, so we get back to this starting position, and this is where Maxime plays knight g8. This is the critical blunder. Mind you, the position is still probably winning for white no matter what black does, but knight g8 gives white a very clear-cut concept and a straightforward plan in order to get this king over to h5. Now with endgame table bases, you'll see that even after knight c6, white is still winning, but it's quite tricky because if you ever move the rook away, black gets the king back to g6. So instead he plays knight to g8, rook h3 played by Fabiano, knight king g6, rook a3, king f7, and now after king f4 we reach the critical position where this is winning, and the reason this is winning is because black can simply not stop the king from getting to h5. For example, if you play king to g6, white goes check, king f7, king g4. If you try to prevent this with king g6, white goes check. You have to go back to protect the knight, and now white gets the king to h5. So this is the first one that's bad. So Maxime plays knight h6, and now here Fabiano plays rook g3. Absolutely perfect move. And the reason that this wins is because now Maxime plays knight g8, but if he plays other moves like king to f8, you go rook to g6, attacking the pawn and the knight because the king no longer guards the square, knight to g8. And now after king f5, you can liquidate into a simple king and pawn endgame, which is winning. For example, if king to f7 here, you play rook g8, king takes f6, and after king h7, you go pawn to g4, king to g8, and you go king g6. If king f8, you go king h7, king f7, g5, and then you just roll the pawn all the way down the board. King supports it. If black does not go to f8, let's say black goes to h8, you go king f7, king h7, g5, king to h8, and now here you have to be careful. You cannot push the pawn, because if you push the pawn to g6, this is a stalemate. The king can no longer move to any of these squares. The white king holds both of these squares, and the pawn covers h7. So what you do here is you play king g6, king to g8, king to h6, and now after king to h8, you go g6, king g8, g7, king f7, king h7, and again you push the pawn and make a queen. So that's why when we go back here to this position, after, well, sorry, I'm way back. So when we go back to this position, after knight e6, rook g3, you cannot move the king. So Maxime plays knight to g8 here, and now you play king to g4. Fabiano goes king g4, and the same thing as I highlighted earlier is that the white king gets to h5, because if you go king g6, again I go king h4, sidestep with a check. Whichever square you go back to, I have king h5. Now again, you're probably wondering, well, I mean, why is this so important? But fortunately in this game, Fabiano plays king g4 and king h5, and you guys get to see a master demonstration of why this is winning with the king here versus the king being on the f file. So Maxime plays knight d5, Fabiano goes rook f3, and what you'll see here is that basically this white king eventually is going to get into either g6 or g7, and black will be unable to protect the pawn. So king e6 played here by Maxime. Again, black can kind of try to wait with like king g7, but after king g7, white can go rook to, actually not rook a3, sorry, rook a3 allows knight f4. White can play something like very calmly g3, stop the check, king f7, and now white can wind the rook all the way around to the king side. Like let's just say you go knight e7, white can go g4, king to e6, and now many moves win, but let's just say, I don't know, let's just say I wait with rook c3, you go king to f7 here, and now white marches the king up, and the point is that you're going to go rook f3. So let's just say black goes here, you can go rook f3, and if king f7, you go g5, hitting the pawn at f6. If pawn to f5, king h7 is winning. And if you try, I don't know, to go check, for example, it's the same thing. King h7, knight e7, rook f3 hits the pawn, you bring the king up, white goes king to g7, attacking the pawn. If f5, there are many ways to win, probably rook e3 and rook e7. This is the cleanest way to win the game. And if black does not play f5 and goes knight d5, you now have the bone crusher rook to f5, and black is in zugzwang, because if you move the king away, I just take, and again same thing, I run the pawn up the board. If you move the knight to e3, I just take and then push this pawn, and the pawn is going all the way up the board again. So it's just losing basically. There's not much you really can do there. So that's why once you get the king to h5, what the king can do from here, like if we go back here, is the king has no real entries to attack this pawn. You need the king to get in to attack the pawn, but you can't do it. So that's why once you get the king to h5, it's winning. It was a draw at multiple points throughout this game is what I would say, but very, very difficult to play. So rook f3, king e6, g4, king e5, king g6, and we get exactly what I just highlighted, where it's just winning. King e4. If king e4, you just lose. So let me go back. So king h5, knight d5, king e6, g4, king e5, king g6, and here Maxime resigns again. He can try to survive with king e6. Actually, there are a couple moves, so I'll go over each one of them. Knight f4, this is the first one. White goes king to f7, and if you go f5, I go g5, same thing. This pawn rolls up the board. If you go king e4, I just very quietly move my rook back, and now your pawn's under attack. If you go back to guard the pawn, I make a check. King has to move off, and no matter where you go, I just take the pawn, and the pawn rolls to the end of the board. If you go knight d5, I just take the pawn again, and we get this one with the pawn rolling up the board. And so there really is nothing else you can do. f5, g5, you move the knight, I take the pawn, you move the king, I check you, and then I collect. So this is losing. And so you can also try king to e4, but then after rook takes f6, same problem. Pawn's going up the board, and you're going to lose the game. So knight f4 and king e4 don't work, and if you go king e6 is the one last trick. White, again, there are many ways to win. The one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to play rook f5. This is a huge blunder, because now black has knight to e7 check, and black is actually winning here. So you don't want to blunder that fork. So what you do here is, there are many ways, but probably the cleanest one is just go king to g7. Again, no f5, because I just take the pawn. King e5, f6, rolling it up the board. So you can't push the pawn, and if you move the knight, obviously I'm just going to take the pawn, like I just take with check. And if you go king e5, it's the same thing. I make the check, king moves, trade, and I roll the pawn up the board. So that's why after king to g6, Maxime resigns here, and Fabiano gets a very big win. I think in terms of a chance to win the tournament, he had to win this game. I don't know if it's must win, but I think it would have been extremely difficult for him to come back and potentially win the event if he was behind by 1 point with only 6 rounds to go. But he wins this game. He is now half a point behind Jan Nepomniachtchi with 6 rounds left, and anything can happen. But I think very good game for Fabiano. Fantastic preparation.